The Nile is one of the great rivers of the world, feeding millions and giving birth to entire civilizations. Since the dawn of history, the Egyptian people have realized that they owe their civilization and their very existence to the Nile River. Habi was the god of the annual flooding of the Nile in pharaonic Egypt. The word Nile is derived from Nilos, the Greek name for the ancient Egyptian river god. Article 44 of Egypt's 2014 constitution stipulates that the state shall protect the Nile River and preserve Egypt's historical rights. It also states that every citizen is guaranteed the right to enjoy the Nile River.
The case of Egypt is different than the case of any other Nile Basin country. Egypt depends totally on the River Nile. 95% of Egypt's water comes from the River Nile. So we have to make sure that our dependence is supported by regulations and so on.
The Nile is the longest river in the world. It flows north for about 6,825 kilometers. The Nile River Basin is shared by 11 countries. The Nile Basin Initiative, NBI, was launched in 1999. Prior to the emergence of the NBI, there was no common institutionalized and structured mechanism that was all-inclusive, bringing together all the riparian countries to address a common agenda. The Ndugo was one of several initiatives created before the NBI. The Ndugo, meaning fraternity in Swahili, focused on the establishment of a Nile Basin economic community. Dr. Boutros Ghali was Egypt's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs at the time of launching the Ndugo in 1983. You proposed establishing the Ndugo Group in 1983, and it only lasted for 10 years. Dr. Boutros, what were the objectives, what were the challenges, and why did it fail?
I was in favor of a creation of an organization which will dealing with the problem of the Nile, the navigation, the irrigation, the problem of distribution of water. This has been done in Asia. What is the great river of Asia? The Mekong.
Yes.
I sent the minister, I paid for the minister of irrigation of all the African countries to pay visits to Asia and to see the Mekong and the organization of the Mekong.
Yes.
I've done a lot of work, but I'm sorry I failed. I have not been successful.
But what about the Ndugo?
I failed too. Nobody take care about Ndugo when I left.
Was this the real problem, or that the Ndugo itself, can you describe the Ndugo for me first?
Ndugo is a first step. It needs a lot of work to move from a first step to a second step. Then you say, oh, Ndugo is not serious. But it is better than nothing. When I left, nobody took care about the Ndugo group.
What were the challenges, sir?
Challenge was to pay more attention to each other. We don't enter in the detail. We can have more trade between those countries, more specialists working in this country.
The Nile Basin Initiative was conceived as a transitional institution until the agreement on the Nile River Basin Cooperative Framework, CFA, enters into force and a permanent institution is created. The Nile River Basin Commission, NRBC, will be established after 6 countries ratify the agreement. The CFA was opened for signature in 2010. It was signed by Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda in 2010, and by Burundi in 2011. Egypt and Sudan oppose signing the CFA, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, and South Sudan have not signed the agreement. The CFA was ratified by Ethiopia and Rwanda in 2013 and by Tanzania in 2015. Peace in Focus spoke to Abdel Gemeda, Speaker of the House of People's Representatives of Ethiopia. Mr. Gemeda is former Minister of National Defense of Ethiopia and former Chief of Intelligence.
This is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. We are not taking, and this treaty was signed in 1959, and our government at that time not taking this treaty, and we are not considering this treaty as our treaty. Let's put the colonial treaty aside. Let's come together ourselves. That is our interest. Secondly, we have the framework agreement between Nile Basin riparian countries. This treaty, this framework agreement is more visible than colonial treaty. It is done by us, those from Congo up to Egypt, all contributors. That treaty said, that framework agreement said, to use this river by win-win, not to ignore one country and benefit other country.
The Nile Basin Initiative includes 10 countries, and Eritrea participates as an observer. Although Egypt took part in launching the MBI in 1999, it had boycotted the initiative since the Cooperative Framework Agreement was signed by 5 MBI member states in 2010. Egypt attended for the first time in 5 years an MBI meeting in Sudan in February 2015. Kenya has expressed its understanding for Egypt's concerns.
We agreed that it's an issue that we must continue to engage on, and hopefully we can actually organize meetings around that issue so that all the options can be put on the table, all the options can be discussed, and agreements can be arrived at, because I think this is a very emotive issue, but it's a real issue as well. So we need to tackle it very, very carefully, ensuring that nobody's rights are diminished in the process.
To understand the extent of the CFA problem, it's important to note that the signed CFA text had been changed before the signing that started in 2010. The signed CFA text is therefore different from the draft agreement negotiated by all the countries and to which Egypt had agreed to 43 out of the 44 articles before the signing. Another significant point is related to Article 2, pertaining to the use of terms in the already signed CFA. Article 2A states that the Nile River Basin means the geographical area determined by the watershed limits of the Nile River system of waters. This term is used where there is reference to environmental protection, conservation, or development. Article 2B of the signed CFA states that the Nile River system means the Nile River and the surface waters and groundwaters which are related to the Nile River. This term is used where there is reference to utilization of water. But the Nile Basin Initiative is a regional intergovernmental partnership with the shared vision of achieving sustainable socio-economic development through equitable utilization of and benefit from the common Nile Basin water resources. Accordingly, Article 2 of the signed CFA is a breach of the MBI shared vision. Although the MBI shared vision focuses on equitable utilization of the Nile Basin water resources, Article 2B of the signed CFA mentions that it is the Nile River system rather than the Nile River Basin water resources that will be utilized. For more insight into the CFA and Egypt's position on the agreement, Peace in Focus spoke to Dr. Mahmoud Abu Zaid, who played a pivotal role in launching the Nile Basin Initiative. Dr. Abu Zaid also took part in the negotiations related to the CFA in his capacity as Egypt's Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation between 1997 and 2009. Joining Peace in Focus is His Excellency Dr. Mahmoud Abu Zaid, President of the Arab Water Council, Honorary President of the World Water Council, and former Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation. Dr. Abu Zaid, thank you so much for joining Peace in Focus. Good to have you, sir.
Thank you.
Egypt took part in establishing the Nile Basin Initiative, which resulted in the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement, the CFA. Egypt and Sudan oppose signing the CFA. What are Egypt's reservations and which articles are still unresolved?
Historically, after the NBI has been signed between the Nile Basin countries, and this is the first time all the countries sign an agreement, all the Nile Basin countries. They decided to go into two tracks. One track is to look into development projects. Each country will submit their proposal for projects in their countries. And the other track is to go into working out an agreement, the CFA agreement. And the negotiations started in 2004. A draft was prepared with the assistance of UNDP, and the draft composed of 44 articles. And between 2004 and 2007, in my view, 43 articles were approved by all the countries.
Including Egypt?
All the countries. Yeah, we were one negotiating team from all the countries, and we had some problem with one article, Article 14. And
14B, which is related to water security.
Yeah, let's say Article 14, which, okay, Egypt wanted to have a reference in the agreement to the water uses, the 55.5, because we discovered, Egypt and Sudan, that it is very hard, sort of impossible, to include all the agreement, the historical agreements in this framework. So we came with a new concept, that's the water security concept, which were put into first in a general form that were not accepted, as I mentioned, by Egypt and Sudan, because we wanted to show a reference to what we are using, the current uses. Huh?
Yeah.
This was the main objective. And we negotiated that, and we came to several proposals, actually 3 proposals. One from Egypt and Sudan, and one from the World Bank, and one from the negotiating team. But we have not agreed to any of these 3 proposals. So negotiations stopped. Well, let me say that we decided on the negotiating table that our role as a negotiating team has been exhausted, and if we want to get approval to this 14 article, and specifically 14B, we have to go to the leaders, and the leaders of the countries will resolve this 14B. At that time, the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Nile Basin was the Minister of Uganda. So the negotiating team asked the Ugandan leader to check with his president and communicate with the other presidents and try to have a meeting to resolve this 14B. That was in 2007. This never happened.
So up till now, 14B is still an unresolved article.
Right.
Article 14 of the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement is on water security, and it says, Nile Basin states therefore agree in a spirit of cooperation, A, to work together to ensure that all states achieve and sustain water security, B, not to significantly affect the water security of any other Nile Basin states. Egypt proposed that Article 14B should be replaced by the following wording, and I quote, not to adversely affect the water security and current uses and rights of any other Nile Basin state, unquote.
So all the countries agreed to 14A. When we came to 14B, there was a proposal, as you mentioned, by the other countries except Egypt and Sudan. And because Egypt and Sudan wanted to include and refer to the existing uses and rights, we proposed 14B and 14B proposal for Egypt and Sudan. And this was not agreed by the other countries.
And it's still unresolved up to now.
Right. But, excuse me,
yes.
They signed the 14B
as an annex.
As an annex with the wording which you just mentioned, and they said that if all the countries have not agreed to that, maybe when the commission, the Nile Commission is formed, then it can look into that and get some agreed upon.
And the commission hasn't been formed up till now?
No, it should happen when the countries ratify the agreement.
When 6 countries ratify, the parliaments of 6 countries ratify the agreement.
So it's abiding to everyone, and they can go into formulation of the commission.
The text of the CFA was developed over more than a decade of intensive work, and Egypt was involved in that. Wasn't it clear for Egypt during the negotiations that the accord, the CFA, is intended to replace the historical agreements, including the 1929 and 1959 treaties?
When the negotiations started for a few years, the draft included the reference to the historical agreement. And the countries did not agree to that, and we looked for an alternative solution, and the water security concept was introduced.
This is very interesting.
Yeah.
And then you ended up having an unresolved article 14B.
Yeah. But here actually this was a compromise from Egypt and Sudan, that let's not insist on having reference to the historical agreement, but we should put an article on water security that refers to the Egyptian water uses, Egyptian and Sudanese water uses.
The treaty is officially called Agreement on the Nile River Basin Cooperative Framework, but does it focus on sharing the water of the Nile River Basin or the Nile River course? What's the difference?
The draft, which was agreed between all the countries by the year 2007, when we talk about water sharing, we referred to the river basin, which means all the water in the basin, including the groundwater, including the rainfall. But we were surprised when we found out that the draft, which was signed, the word water basin was replaced by water course, which is quite different.
How different, sir?
Well, water course is only the water which runs into the river, while the basin also means all the water resource.
How can this harm Egypt's quota of the Nile's water, which amounts to 55.5 billion cubic meters annually?
Well, instead of looking into 84 billion cubic meters, we look into 1,666 billion. So we look at the development and the use of all the water which falls on the basin, not only the little water which runs into the course.
So if all of them are going to share the 84, then, I mean, this means that cutting down the quotas of Egypt and Sudan, right?
It's not only cutting, it means that the other countries are free to use whatever they want without even has any comparison to what Egypt and Sudan is using. I mean, they have a lot of water which they use and they can use while they are looking into getting a piece of the cake, the very small cake,
And
84.
and was this like did Egypt express reservation about this point, or it passed without expressing any reservation?
Well, the main reservation was against the 14B, but later on, other reservations came also on two other articles by the ministers who came after me. They raised other issues too.
And was this issue raised also?
We did send this as an observation. Yeah.
Mm. And what about the two other articles? Because I understand that Article 14 was the main article, unresolved article.
There are two articles actually. The prior notification. The principle was in the draft, in the agreement itself, but the procedure was not mentioned. So there was opposition from Egypt that the procedure should be agreed upon and put into the main body of the agreement. The other is the rules of if we need to change any article in the agreement, what is who should is it going to be approved by consensus or by the majority? This was also part. The Egyptian minister later on, they were insisting on having the approval by consensus. While during the negotiations up to the year 2007, all the Nile Basin countries agreed, and Egypt was among them, that some articles by consensus and some articles by majority. Not all the articles have the same weight, and this was not approved by the minister who came after.
Ethiopia rejects the historical agreements, including the colonial era 1929 agreement signed between Egypt and Great Britain and the 1959 agreement signed between Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia's position is that such agreements should be replaced by the 2010 Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement, the CFA. What's Egypt's position on this? And let's start with the historical agreements.
These historical agreements are agreements between mostly two countries. And none of these agreements have been signed when Ethiopia is under occupation. The two agreements with Ethiopia were when they were...
it wasn't colonized.
It wasn't colonized, you know.
At that point when the agreements were signed.
With Ethiopia.
Yes.
So it's strange that they object to agreements which do not involve them, you know. Okay, the other agreements involve other countries. And the international law actually handle this situation. So if a country has been under occupation and an agreement was signed with whoever occupied the country, and they became independent after that, the international law state that they have to abide to these agreements, irrespective of the fact if they were under occupation or not. So I don't think that they have a strong case when they say so.
The 1902 treaty between Great Britain and Ethiopia was signed by His Majesty the Emperor, King of the Kings of Ethiopia. In July 1993, the Cairo Cooperation Framework was signed between Egypt and Ethiopia, from which 86% of Egypt's Nile water originates. It says that each party should refrain from engaging in any activity related to the Nile water that may cause appreciable harm to the interests of the other party. How binding is this agreement?
It was not ratified. It was agreed by the two parliaments, but it did not go to the United Nations. And I hope that our friends and brothers in Ethiopia take this as an abiding agreement, and they are committed to it, because it talks about the right of both Egypt and Sudan in developing the river water and not causing any harm to anyone. So it's a very nice, very good.
So the fact that it was not ratified by both countries means that it's not legally binding.
Well, we can't say so, because the two presidents of the countries at that time signed it. So they should respect it, actually. I mean, we're not talking about going to the court and the international court and see if it's abiding or not. But in good faith, both countries should accept it.
What will be the result if 6 Nile Basin countries ratify the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement?
So it's going to be binding to the 6 countries, only the 6 countries.
Will this in any way affect Egypt's
No.
quota
No.
of from the River Nile?
I wouldn't think so. No.
But it will not be legally binding for Egypt?
No, not Egypt or North Sudan.
Will it be a breach of the 2014 Egyptian constitution if Egypt accepts signing the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement the way it is now?
Not the draft which has been approved, but if they change it, if they modify it according to the Egyptian and Sudanese suggestion, of course, we would love to.
It will not be a breach of the constitution then?
No.
But
Because,
right now it is a breach of the constitution. I mean, if
is.
Egypt signs, it will be a breach of the constitution.
Exactly.
What is needed for Egypt to sign the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement, and how much has been achieved?
Most of it already has been agreed upon. If there is enough reference in the agreement, at least the corrected article of 14b.
Amending
At
Article
least.
14b.
The amended article, at least 14b.
And then, and you think that there is hope? I mean, looking at what's happening on the scene now, I mean, are they working towards doing this?
Yeah, I'm very sure there is a good chance, especially if we know that some of the countries have suggested other forms of 14b.
What do you mean, Doctor?
Other proposals, not the suggested 14b. There are other suggestions also. We have two wording now, one by Egypt and Sudan and one by the rest of the countries. Now there are other people trying to come up with wording which could be accepted by Egypt and Sudan. There are countries and there are international institutions, the World Bank, the US.
Your Excellency, Dr. Mahmoud Abu Zaid, President of the Arab Water Council, Honorary President of the World Water Council, and former Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation, thank you so much for joining Peace in Focus. It has been interesting talking to you, sir.
Thank you.